Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, if you look around the world right now, it's hard to miss the rising geopolitical tensions. And, well, an immediate consequence of that is military budgets are just ballooning everywhere. But while the headlines are all about new fighter jets and defense deals, we want to drill down into something often overlooked. That's the critical intersection between national security spending and the health of our environment. Today, we're specifically diving into a really timely paper. It's titled, How a 5% GDP Military Investment Could Impact European Union Biodiversity. It's led by Sousa and colleagues and published in Ecological Solutions and Evidence. So our mission here is to unpack this research, really understand what it means in concrete terms for Europe's natural heritage when defense becomes such a major priority.
Yeah, and what's striking, I think, is that the paper isn't just theoretical. I mean, the analysis is grounded in actual commitments being discussed. Following recent NATO talks, member countries, well, most of them, Spain's the exception here, have committed to aim for 5% of their GDP on defense by 2035.
5%, that sounds huge.
It is. And it's broken down, sort of, into 3.5% for what they call core defense spending and another 1.5% for related security stuff.
Yeah.
And you have to remember, this is layered right on top of the EU's own Readiness 2030 plan. That plan alone is talking about an $800 billion investment over just 4 years.
Wow. Okay, $800 billion just for the EU plan, plus this NATO target. That's a staggering amount of resources. So how quickly do the authors think this diversion of money starts hitting things like conservation budgets, which are often pretty small to begin with?
Exactly. That's the core issue the paper flags. Resources aren't infinite, right? If a country is pouring money into defense on this scale, it's almost certainly coming from somewhere else. So the authors looked at 23 EU countries who are also NATO members. They tracked their defense spending from 2014 up to 2024, so last decade, basically.
And what did they find? Was there already a trend?
Oh, yeah. They used a linear mixed model and found a steady and statistically very significant increase in the percentage of GDP going to defense over that period. The p-value was less than 0.0001. So yeah, the trend is already very much established. It's not hypothetical.
Okay, so the momentum is already building. What's the potential scale then, the actual numbers involved in this trade-off?
Well, the shift is pretty dramatic. In 2024, the defense spending for these 23 countries combined was around $300 billion.
Okay.
Now, if they actually hit that 5% GDP target by 2035, the paper projects that number could jump to nearly $800 billion a year.
$800 billion.
Yeah, so you're talking about a difference of almost €500 billion annually. That's the pot of money that potentially gets diverted from other public services.
Right, and that's the core financial trade-off looming over everything else. So let's zero in on where that hurts most for conservation. Where does this budget crunch hit first?
Well, the paper outlines several pretty severe consequences. First, the obvious one. Funds get pulled directly from other areas. Social programs, health, education. And critically for this discussion, from non-military scientific research and environmental initiatives. Conservation programs specifically could face more cuts. That means fewer staff in protected areas, less money for monitoring illegal stuff like poaching or logging.
And weaker enforcement, too, I imagine.
Exactly. Weaker enforcement of the conservation laws we already have, which arguably is one of the most damaging things. And beyond national budgets, they also predict cuts to overseas development assistance, or ODA.
Ah, so international aid for conservation.
Precisely. Aid going to those really biodiverse but often poorer regions that rely heavily on international support for their conservation work.
Okay, so direct funding cuts, less enforcement, less international aid. But there's a political angle, too, isn't there? The paper suggests the mindset might shift.
Absolutely. That's perhaps the most insidious risk they highlight. A political relaxation, you could call it. The worry is that governments focused laser-like on military buildup might start seeing ambitious environmental policies. You know, things like the European Green Deal, the EU Biodiversity Strategy 2030, the Nature Restoration Law. They might start seeing these not as vital long-term goals, but as, well, inconvenient obstacles getting in the way of rapid military expansion.
So the political will could just evaporate.
Potentially, yes. The priorities shift away from those long-term sustainability goals toward more immediate security concerns.
Okay, that covers the financial and political hit. But the paper makes a strong case that military activities themselves have a huge physical impact, even just training in peacetime. What are the key direct impacts? What's the physical footprint look like?
Well, first, just the sheer amount of land involved is staggering. More military bases, expanded training areas, and of course, the potential for actual conflict.
Yeah.
It all leads directly to deforestation, draining wetlands, breaking up habitats. The paper cites a really striking figure from the U.S. context, actually.
Yeah.
It says that in the U.S., more land outside Alaska is set aside for military use than for all the national parks and national wildlife refuges combined.
Wow. That really puts the scale into perspective. It's huge.
It is.
And it's not just about taking up space, right? What about the actual wear and tear when they use that land for training and maneuvers?
Well, you get these unavoidable physical impacts, things
Right.
like severe soil compaction from heavy vehicles, tanks, trucks rolling over the same ground repeatedly.
Hmm.
That fundamentally changes the soil structure, which then affects which plants can grow there, altering the whole ecosystem.
Hmm. And then there's the pollution side of things.
Oh, definitely. You've got risks of oil spills, contamination from heavy metals used in ammunition or equipment, potentially even radioactive waste in some historical contexts. Plus, you've got the introduction of persistent toxic chemicals, things from propellants, explosives, solvents, fuels. The paper mentions specific research, for instance, on redback salamanders being exposed to 2 below 4 dinitrotoluene.
Which is common in military waste.
Exactly. And it sticks around in the environment. It can accumulate in organisms. It's nasty stuff.
And thinking about large-scale exercises, noise and light must be major factors too. All those vehicles, artillery practice, maybe nighttime operations.
Huge factors, major stressors for wildlife. Naval sonar, heavy artillery fire. The noise alone can disrupt animal communication, mess with migration routes, interfere with breeding, and light pollution at night disrupts nocturnal species. The paper gives a pretty stark historical example, the disappearance of entire coral fish communities around Mururoa Atoll after the nuclear tests there, largely due to the underwater shockwaves, which wiped them out.
That's devastating. And I remember seeing a figure in the paper linking the military globally to climate change emissions as well.
Yes, that's a big indirect impact, but a major one. Globally, the military-industrial complex is estimated to contribute around 5.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions.
5.5%, that's
It
significant.
really is. It's a massive, ongoing, indirect environmental cost that underpins the whole security apparatus.
Okay, one last direct impact mentioned was invasive species. How do military operations play into that? They move a lot of stuff around the world.
They absolutely do. Military activities are, well, almost infamous for creating pathways for non-native species. They disturb habitats during construction and training, which creates opportunities for invaders to get a foothold, and troop movements, equipment transport. They can carry seeds, insects, even vertebrates unintentionally.
Like hitchhiker.
Exactly. The paper uses the kind of textbook example. The brown tree snake, Boiga irregularis, it got introduced to Guam, likely via military transport during or after World War II. And the consequences were catastrophic. It's blamed for the extirpation, the local extinction of several native bird species, mammals, reptiles on the island. A classic, tragic case study.
Right. So, putting it all together, you've got the financial squeeze draining conservation funds, and then the direct activities, destroying habitats, polluting, contributing to climate change, spreading invasive species. It's a double whammy.
It really is.
Now, the authors aren't saying Europe should just abandon defense spending, obviously. So what are their practical suggestions? How can this damage be mitigated, at least partly?
Well, the core philosophy they put forward is crucial, I think. It's this idea that genuine, sustainable security actually depends on having healthy ecosystems. Environmental health is fundamental to long-term economic stability and societal resilience. You can't really separate them.
Okay, so start from that principle. What follows from that?
Based on that, they propose several specific mitigation measures. First is a big push for greener technology within the military itself. So adopting things like hybrid electric tactical vehicles. The U.S. military apparently has a prototype.
Interesting.
And mandating much stricter waste management protocols during training exercises and deployments, basically cleaning up their act.
Right. Using that military innovation muscle for environmental benefit where possible. That makes sense. What about stopping those invasive species hitchhikers?
Now, that falls under biosecurity. They call for really strict quarantine protocols and comprehensive decontamination procedures for all equipment, vehicles, personnel moving between different regions or ecosystems, trying to shut down those accidental transport routes.
Okay, so green tech, better biosecurity. What about policy?
That's the third pillar, policy balance. They argue strongly for developing EU-wide policies that mandate environmental impact assessments, EIAs, for all significant military projects.
Mandate them so they couldn't be skipped.
Exactly. The idea is that these EIAs must require defense planning to fully incorporate and adhere to established biodiversity conservation principles. Basically, environmental review can't just be waived because a project is labeled essential for national security. It needs proper scrutiny.
That seems like a really critical point, ensuring environmental laws aren't sidelined. But, one of the most fascinating things that comes up in this kind of discussion is this weird paradox with military lands themselves.
Ah, yes, the paradox of war ecology, or fortress conservation, sometimes it's called. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? Because human access is usually so restricted on active or even former military training grounds, they can sometimes inadvertently become biodiversity hotspots.
How does that work?
Well, the lack of general development, farming, or intensive recreation is one factor, but also the specific type of disturbance from military activities, things like occasional controlled fires or the soil disturbance from vehicles. It can actually favor certain rare species that depend on those kinds of open, disturbed habitats, like specific types of insects, butterflies, or wildflowers.
So the disturbance itself creates unique niches.
Sometimes, yes. And the paper points to some successful European examples where this is actually being actively managed for conservation alongside military use. Places like Dubertzer Heide in Germany, Salisbury Plain in the UK, Campe Garrigue in France. In fact, they note that countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany already include quite extensive military training areas within the Natura 2000 network.
The EU's Protected Areas Network.
That's right, which demonstrates that it is possible to integrate conservation management with ongoing defense activities if there's the will to do it.
That integrated management model feels like the most, optimistic path forward described here.
It is definitely a positive angle, but ultimately the authors circle back to what they see as the most immediate and pressing concern, and that's the sheer scale of the financial trade-off and the associated risk of those policy shifts we talked about, the weakening of hard-won conservation goals and environmental laws.
That loss of momentum.
Exactly. Policies that took decades to build could be eroded quite quickly if the political priorities shift dramatically towards defense. That's the risk that seems to keep them up at night, so to speak.
Yeah, that's the big picture risk that hangs over all of this. And the paper leaves us with a pretty stark final thought, doesn't it? Something for all of us to consider.
It does. They basically say while wars and conflicts might eventually end, the loss of biodiversity is permanent. It's irreversible. And that loss fundamentally undermines the very basis of life on Earth, including eventually our own security.
It really makes you think about what constitutes security in the long run. It pushes us to reflect on whether the ultimate security measure might actually lie in addressing the root causes of conflict through diplomacy, through sustainable development, maybe reducing the perceived need for such massive military spending in the first place. But it also raises another interesting question, maybe a more pragmatic one for right now. Could the immense pressure and funding going into strengthening military capabilities actually be leveraged? Could it be used, paradoxically, to accelerate the adoption of green technologies and better land management practices, maybe even creating a net positive for biodiversity in some areas if managed correctly? It's a complex thought, definitely something for you to chew on.